All right, let's get started. This will be your introductory chapter to your textbook on Criminalistics by Richard Saperstein. It's basically information that you've had in your lower level courses, but it's information that it's important for you to have a knowledge of, but it's going to be basically an overview of information you've already been exposed to, but which is important. All right, forensic science, just as a review, is an application of science to the law, both civil laws and criminal laws. You're primarily going to be concerned with the criminal law side, and the criminal justice system is composed of the police, the courts, which includes the prosecutor's office and the defense side, and another component of the criminal justice system is corrections. But you're primarily going to be involved in the police or law enforcement investigative side, and also in the court trials and various functions that take place in the adjudication process. Areas of forensics combine a wide array of studies. The American Academy of Forensic Science lists 11 different areas of forensics that their members can choose to belong to, and we'll talk about that a little bit during this presentation. Talking about the history and development of forensic science. In reality, the beginning of forensic science started before it was even developed. Its roots go back in literature to a 19th century fictional private detective by the name of Sherlock Holmes, who was a character developed by the author of the Sherlock Holmes stories, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Holmes was noted for using scientific methods and reasoning, deductive reasoning, to solve the various mysteries he was involved in. Some of the stories talk about using blood evidence and other scientific means that were not in use at that time, had yet to be discovered, but are now everyday parts of our current investigative process. So Sherlock Holmes stories were interesting reading, and I would recommend anybody that has a chance to read the complete stories of Sherlock Holmes, because there's information that can be learned in those areas. Some important real-life contributors to the field of forensic science. You have Matthew Orfila, who was involved in the initial involvement in the study of toxicology or poisons. Alphonse Bertillon. Bertillon is considered the father of criminal identification. He was a French police clerk, and he started the criminal identification in a field called anthropometry, or taking various measurements of the body. That lasted for a while until it was eventually replaced by the science of fingerprints. And Bertillon was able to include the fingerprinting in his anthropometry index, and also just as a point of effort, meaning he had the ability to change with the times and with the methods, and as you recall, he was given credit as the first person in Europe to solve a murder case by the use of fingerprints. There were many figures that were involved in the development of the science of fingerprints. The first person that did any in-depth study of fingerprints was Sir Francis Galton. In fact, he developed the naming of the various fingerprint patterns, which are still in use today. He took the loop, the whorl, and the arch, and then he gave them sub-classifications, which we'll be discussing later on. Moving along, Calvin Goddard, who had been a colonel in the U.S. Army, is credited with developing the field of firearms examination, sometimes known as ballistics. It's an area where you can discover or take the characteristics from the rifle barrel or handgun barrel that are imprinted upon a projectile and can be linked back. The projectile can be linked back to a specific barrel of a handgun or a rifle or long gun. But Goddard is given credit as being the person who started the development of the field of firearms examination. Now, just as importantly, not only for firearms examinations, but other comparative fields in the forensics, Walter McCrone developed the first comparison microscope. And not only did he just develop the microscope, he trained hundreds of scientists on how to use the comparison microscope. Many of those were involved or went on to be involved in the field of forensic investigations. The first person to write a book on criminal investigations was Hans Gross of Austria. He wrote a book that's still in publication today and contains information that is very useful. Then there was Edmond Locard. Locard was a criminalist for the French police, and he is credited with developing or founding of the first crime lab in Europe, which was located in Lyon, France. And he's also just as famous for his Locard's exchange principle, which is the basis of forensic investigations and its growth today, where when someone comes to a scene of a crime, they leave traces themselves on the scene, and when they leave, they take traces from the scene with them. So Locard's theory is a theory that you should know verbatim right off the top of your head if you're going to be involved in the field of forensic investigations. Now let's talk about the setup of crime laboratories. If you recall your American history, the United States has a fragmented system of government from city to county to state and federal government. It was developed that way as opposed to the rule of where we originated from in the United Kingdom, where it was a king system. We wanted the power to be broken down with equal power to various systems of government, with local government The theory at that time was that local government should be the most have the most direct contact with the with human behavior and government. And we did not want a king to rule, and we split up the power between those different entities. So our police system is built that way, and it only follows that our criminal laboratory system would be that way. At the federal level, there are four primary federal crime labs, and the FBI is considered the top crime lab, not only in the United States but also worldwide, followed by ATF, alcohol, tax, tobacco, and firearms, and also they've added explosions to that. That took place in the 80s when there were a number of church arsons and explosions and bombings of various health clinics and churches. So they were given federal jurisdiction in those investigations. Then the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, we've been involved in the war on drugs since the early 1970s, and they are part of the Department of Justice, and their lab is primarily identifying various drugs and doing other criminal scientific investigations to help to assist in the prosecution of drug cases. And then the fourth one is a little known investigative unit called the Postal Inspection Service, the U.S. Mails. They have a lab because there's a lot of crimes committed through the mail, stealing the mail, stealing credit cards out of the mail, and it's a federal level offense. It's a federal offense to do any violations against the mail system. So that means it's interstate violations, and in the federal government, since it involves interstate crime, has jurisdiction over those types of crimes. Now, one criminal area or one lab that was not mentioned here is the military. The military has a number of labs. The Navy has a lab under NCIS, which is for both the Navy and the Marine Corps. The Air Force OSI has their own lab, and the Army, the Criminal Investigation Division, also has a very large lab, and these provide lab services to military investigative units on a worldwide basis. We're going to just lightly cover some foreign labs. Foreign labs, basically because they have most of them have a different government setup. Most European countries have the power belongs at the federal level, or the federal level. So it's their lab systems are more centralized. Their police systems are part of state government. You would think that's more looks like a military function than a police function in some of these countries. The most renowned foreign lab is, of course, Scotland Yard. They've also New Scotland Yard, because it was rebuilt a decade or so, a couple decades ago. And not only do they provide serious crime investigations, but they also provide criminal crime lab services. Some countries have regional crime labs, and in some of these countries, the local agencies, the local law enforcement, city, county, township, whatever, have to pay the federal or regional lab for the lab services that they provide for that agency. So it's a little bit different, a different setup than we have in the United States, but our system of government is different than most governments throughout the world. Next, we're going to address laboratory services. But first of all, before we get into talking about those services, we are not all labs provide the same level of services. They also are not specialized. Some labs are not specialized. It really depends on the size of the agency. Even in Polk County, there are not any full service labs located in Polk County. They do some minor lab work, but lab work is relegated outside to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement or to the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Areas that you would find in a full service lab are physical science, looking at trace evidence. Then you would have a biological unit, would be looking at blood evidence, other biological materials. Firearms lab or ballistics labs to do comparison of projectiles to various firearms. Question documents, those are looking at documents that have question writings on them and attempting to identify the author of the writing on the document. Photography, which is part of almost all labs, whether it's city, county, state, or federal. Crime scene photography, evidence photography, doing macro photography of projectiles and other items that are used for comparison. Also, a new area of photography is surveillance photography. These, as you know, the use of surveillance cameras has expanded greatly over the last 10 to 20 years, and most locations, retail locations, have surveillance cameras. And daily, if you're on Facebook, you'll see where agencies have published photographs of people committing crimes, asking for the public to assist in identifying them. So the processing of these surveillance videos has become a position within itself in some labs. In fact, here locally, Lakeland PD expanded their lab to have one person within the lab dedicated to pulling up photographs from these surveillance cameras so they can be used in the investigative process. Labs have also undergone a transition. Photographic sections of labs have undergone a transition of moving from film cameras to digital cameras. Again, agencies have been able to do away with their chemical darkrooms for the processing of film. and those photographs are now completed through digital, with the use of printers and software programs, and the use of the chemical processing is no longer needed. Another significant area is latent fingerprints. Local labs sometimes have a fingerprint expert on staff who will, with the assistance of the NCIC system, work in identifying scenes left by perpetrators of crime scenes. We of course know that the way that fingerprints are presented on our various TV shows is completely different than what happens in actual life, and a real life examiner, a fingerprint examiner, has to make the identification. Now, they listed in the textbook polygraph as being part of the forensic laboratory services, and I'm not sure exactly where that came from. It's been my experience since I work in that field that polygraph is usually assigned either to the criminal investigative section or to the personnel section for screening of police applicants and civilian applicants, and the examiners there primarily provide screening exams, but then they also are available to assist the criminal investigation division with criminal polygraphs. So it's I've never seen it really attached to any sort of a lab service, because it's really part investigative, part personnel. So it can be assigned almost anywhere, but it requires a trained individual who is usually not involved in other types of forensics. Voice print is available in maybe major crime labs. Voice print would be taking recording telephone conversations or other conversations and being able to attribute the voice on that conversation to a specific individual. I've only had one time in my entire career where I've used voice print, and that was in the 1970s in some sort of I don't even recall specifics, but it was like a bomb threat investigation, and trying to tie the suspect's voice to a taped voice telephone call. And at that point in time, voice print was not that reliable, but as technology has progressed, it's become more reliable, but it's still not a major part of most crime labs. Now, crime scene, the people who go out and collect the evidence can either be the sole job, that's all they do is go out and collect and document evidence, which maintain the chain of custody, do the fingerprinting, for dusting of the crime scene, collecting other types of evidence, and then they turn that over to the lab personnel for further analysis and evaluation. In some labs, being a crime scene investigator is also a function of people who work in the lab. They multitask. They may be doing crime scene work, or when they're not doing crime scene work, they may be doing fingerprint identification work, photography processing, further collecting evidence off of items that were brought in for processing to be packaged and sent off to other crime labs like Florida Department of Law Enforcement or to the FBI. So crime scene is a significant part of most labs, but sometimes it's under the jurisdiction of the Criminal Investigation Division, or supervision of the Criminal Investigation Division. In other agencies, it might be a very large agencies. It might be their own independent unit with their own commander. It just depends on the size and the services that are provided by each individual lab. Now, the functions of a forensic scientist or a lab technician is involved in the analysis of physical evidence, whether it's biological evidence or trace evidence, fingerprint evidence, chemical evidence, all those areas. And they operate using the scientific method. You probably should know for your future, for now and in your future, what the components of the scientific method are, and be able to pull that off the top of your head, just like you can the Locard exchange principle. Physical evidence has become more important as we've developed. We used to give a lot of weight, and we still do, to witness testimony, but we have found that through studies that victims are often unreliable, eyewitnesses are unreliable. There's a lot of variables that are involved in that, is the environmental conditions, lighting, the witness's eyesight, the witness's ability to focus, how they react to dangerous situations. And then there's also the use of informants that are sometimes called to testify in cases. And when you use informants, there is always a question about the motive of the informant. Most informants are criminals or former criminals who have made some sort of a deal with the prosecution for some sort of a benefit to themselves in order to provide testimony. Some people and they've been known to provide false testimony against a defendant. So although we still have to rely on witness testimony, because all cases do not present us with physical evidence, either due to the lack of the availability of someone to process a scene or someone to competently process a scene. So you always know you have a fairly good case when you have strong physical evidence against a defendant. We're aware of a number of cases through the Project Innocence, where people who were not involved in a crime have been convicted of those crimes, only later to be released years down the road through DNA analysis and other information. So when we have physical evidence, that is good for our investigative process. Now, if you continue in this field of endeavor in forensics, you may be called upon to testify in court as a witness, and maybe even an expert witness based on your training and your field experience. Some of you may go on to work as a latent fingerprint examiner, where you can identify fingerprints. Others could be specialized in other areas. Being an expert witness is somebody who has specific knowledge about a topic that is not normally held by the common person. So they have expertise that most of the rest of the population does not have. Now, there's several Supreme Court decisions that bear on whether expert testimony, even scientific evidence, will be allowed to be presented in court. The first decision from the early 1900s was the Fry decision, and said that any scientific evidence had to be recognized by the general scientific field. So it could not be some new type of science that was developed and did not have a history of proving itself. It had to be something that was generally accepted. And then we went along to the Daubert and Carmichael decisions, which were more recent in the 1989-90 area. And these decisions made it easier to get expert testimony and scientific testimony to be presented. And in fact, they lowered made the trial judge the gatekeeper of whether or not scientific or expert witness testimony would be allowed at trial. So instead of relying on the general acceptance, it was the decision-making ability of a judge to determine whether or not he would allow the evidence at trial. And usually they would have a separate hearing to go over the validity of the evidence and whether the person qualified to be an expert. Florida was operating under Fry until a couple of years ago when it adopted the Daubert philosophy. Majority of states, the federal government has adopted Daubert, and the majority of states have adopted the Daubert decision as their guideline for the admittance of expert and scientific evidence. There are some other forensic services that are usually contracted out to private experts. Forensic psychiatry. Most police agencies do not have a forensic psychiatrist on staff, and it's maybe only rarely used by the FBI in their profiling, but the court has the ability to retain forensic psychologists to do evaluations on defendants to determine if they are competent to stand trial. That's the primary use of psychiatry. Forensic odontology, which is teeth impressions, bite marks. That's not something that would be on staff with any agency. That would be contracted out to someone who has been a dentist, and then they've developed themselves into being a forensic odontologist, and that's how they make their living, by identifying bite marks and individualizing them to a specific suspect. Forensic engineering. Those are people who are actual engineers. I have a friend of mine who is a materials failure engineer for Mosaic, and I drew upon his experience in a case that I handled as a defense investigator, and using his his knowledge and expertise. We filmed a scenario involving a alleged child abuse case where a kid was allegedly hung by a belt from a gun rack that was nailed into a wall, and we were able to prove that it was not feasible for that to have taken place. And we also were able to point out that I was able to point out that the jurisdiction that was involved in the investigation had not even documented and taken into custody the gun rack that was purportedly used, or even determined whether there had been any marks on the wall or anything like that, which went a long way towards getting the defendant exonerated of serious criminal charges. And there's going to be all sort of strange, or not strange, but forensic jobs that are out there that are little known, and that you may have to contract for outside services. You know, there's dogs that are trained to find human remains, to track people. So that is technically since it involves science, that is technically can be part of the scientific forensic field. Okay, that wraps up chapter 1. Other than reviewing this slide presentation, I would encourage you to do in-depth reading on your chapters. You're going to be held responsible for the information in the chapters on your examinations, and most of this first chapter is things that you have already been exposed to, and that you need to put into your long-term memory. So that'll be the end of this current lecture.